Thanks for checking out my video about case studies. I'm going to share with you what I wish I would have learned sooner. And that is that each individual case study, for example, exploratory, explanatory, descriptive, must have the research questions written the correct way and aligned. Same thing with the interview questions. If you ask the wrong questions, you're going to get the wrong data. The wrong data means the wrong results. And therefore, your research is probably not going to be as significant and substantial as you thought it might be. Check out this lesson and learn. And if you'll do me a favor, like the video or dislike the video and subscribe. Tell me what you like. Tell me what you didn't like. The case study. It's really an in-depth analysis of a single or small number of units. And I'll give you an example. If you wanted to do a case study of a hospital and you want to just find out what happened inside an emergency room because of a situation that occurred in the middle of night and several ambulances pulled up, and you wanted to later find out how everything went, you might talk to just the nurses. That could be a single case study. But if you want to look at also gaining information from the doctors, from the anesthesiologists, from the patients themselves, from the leaders of the organization, that would make it an analysis of a multiple case study, because then you would have a small number of units. For example, there you might have 5 different groups of people that you interview. They all have different jobs. And by getting inputs from all of those people, you get more of a robust understanding of what happened in that situation. Consider case studies right for situations. There's something that have happened or perhaps may happen in the future. We can do research on things that have not happened yet. For example, if we want to find out what life would be like on Mars. Well, nobody's been to Mars yet, but we have a lot of scientists. We have a lot of people who have explored Mars through technology and through equipment that we've sent there. So we can get a pretty good understanding about what life would be like on Mars with never having gone there. It's commonly applied in dissertation research. I have seen some case studies that are done outside of dissertation research, but they tend to be more so for funded research for a specific purpose. For example, in the hospital setting, if somebody wanted to find out how things happened in that situation, perhaps the owner of the hospital, perhaps maybe it's a company like Healthcare Systems who own many hospitals, they might want to do an analysis to get the information. They also might want to do such similar types of research in different hospitals as well, making it even more robust of an understanding of what happens, not just in one hospital, but in many. A case study can have a quantitative component, and I don't mean a statistical component. But if, for example, in your case study, you had information that you wanted to find out that had a certain amount of number value to it, like, for example, if you were collecting information that was pertinent to the case study about how many people were involved, if you wanted to get the average age, the average length of service that they have had, those would be a quantitative component, not necessarily only demographic information, but oftentimes people will do a case study with a quantitative component. They may analyze secondary data, and that may be used for producing the questions in a case study. A single person, a group of people, an organization, institution can be ripe for a case study. You can apply a case study almost anywhere, as well as just about everywhere. So as you start to look at a case study and its true value, take a look at how you want to scope your case study. In doctoral dissertation research, we try to scope it to something that's manageable. And I'll give you some examples as I go through this lesson strategy of what I'm referring to. It's a single situation or longitudinal. What that means is you could do a case study at one location and how it is that happened. Perhaps it happened last week, and you just want to know what happened in that situation. Or perhaps over time, you do a longitudinal study. So maybe you're going to do the analysis now of what happened recently, then again in a similar situation 6 months from now, then 18 months later, maybe 2 years later, to see how things have changed over time. That's longitudinal. It's not just one study, but it's many studies that get added together to get an understanding how things change over time. This is probably not the ideal situation, one of these longitudinal studies for a doctoral dissertation, because students want to get done. Perhaps, though, they might do the single situation. And once they graduate, if the topic is of interest to them, then do a longitudinal study and repeat what they've done later after they've graduated. A case study offers a rich and robust overview. How rich and how robust will depend upon how this person who's doing the research or people doing the research open up the opportunity. For example, if you're just going to do a single case study, that may not be so rich and so robust. But if you interview different groups of people, as I mentioned in the earlier example of nurses and doctors, anesthesiologists, other groups of people who were involved in the situation, then you start to see where you get this rich, robust overview because you're getting many different perspectives from different people who have different jobs and responsibilities, but yet they were all in the same situation dealing with whatever happened at that time. The case study often has questions, and I'm referring now to not only the research question for a study, but interview questions where people are asked how, why, and describe types of questions. How did something occur? Why do you believe it happened? Describe what you did. This will be information that we would want to get to gain that robust overview. In a research question, we might look for how do people describe something for a descriptive case study. If we're looking at the how and why more so, without any specific description sought or an explanation, we might be doing more of an exploratory because we're looking for a broader type of information. How might life be on Mars? That would be a good question for a research study that's looking at that kind of information. Case study findings pretty much tells a story. In the case of that situation at the hospital, if one was to do that multiple case study, imagine the story you'll be able to tell what happened from the time the first ambulance arrived, how that last patient was taken care of in the emergency room. You would get a pretty rich, robust understanding of the entire story by talking with those different stakeholders who were involved. There's no one way to apply a case study. I've seen people apply in many different ways, so if you happen to find a way that's maybe not the exact same way that somebody else did it, don't worry. It doesn't mean it's wrong. For example, some faculty members like to have students do a case study and seek data saturation, whereas other faculty do not require it. This is the same of researchers in organizations or anywhere else researchers do research. It's not uncommon. There are many different ways to do a specific research study. So don't be too concerned if here I might tell you, well, I don't really think there's a need for data saturation in a case study because maybe you're only interviewing 4 or 5 people in the situation of that hospital. Maybe you're going to interview 5 nurses and 5 doctors and 5 anesthesiologists and 5 staff members. Well, if you're only interviewing 5 of each group, I'm not sure data saturation is needed. But I do know some of my peers who require it. How they decide to test for that saturation is way beyond the means for this case study lesson, but I am going to address data saturation in a completely different lesson in this program. So if you're wondering what data saturation is or how to apply it, take a listen over there and you'll be able to see and hear in that lesson how I describe what data saturation is. For dissertation research, well, of course, we have to fill in the gap in the literature. If you're in a practitioner degree, perhaps maybe you're looking at the gap or difference between theory and practice. We still need to look at what is this gap, because in essence, what we do with doctoral dissertation research is we try to fill this gap with our data that we get, the findings from that data specifically, because when we produce our recommendations and conclusions, hopefully that closes the gap because we've helped people to understand how to lessen the problem they had in the beginning, which was really the essence of the reason for the study. In corporate research, we still look at this gap, but it's usually defined differently. It's defined as a problem and what's going on perhaps between how a process should be running and how it is running, or the difference between what type of financial revenue should be generated and what is being generated. And that can be the gap. So a gap isn't always about literature. A gap is really something that can be considered a concern or a problem. It just so happens in doctoral dissertation research, we tend to refer to it as a gap in the literature, particularly if you're doing a PhD. If you're doing something more of a practitioner degree, maybe you're getting a doctorate of education or you're getting a doctorate of business administration. There, some universities have the focus on the gap being what's the difference between what theory says and what practice is actually doing. This is considered in a wider field or body of knowledge. When you think of a case study, think of it as more than just research. This wider field or body of knowledge in research is an opportunity with a case study to really open up and gain greater insights over what has happened in regards to why the case studies apply. When we consider a wider field or the body of knowledge, we're looking at the wider field or the body of knowledge of research itself. Because of its flexibility and its ability to produce these rich, robust findings, oftentimes a case study is just the beginning of something. There'd be something more in the sense of what other research could be done. For example, you might do a case study on that hospital situation, and you might find what the common factors were in how people did their work, or find some common understandings, and then you would group those common understandings. Perhaps they'll be generated as different themes, and those themes can be the essence for creating a quantitative survey later. Perhaps you create a Likert type survey in regards to all the themes to find out to what extent do other people in other hospitals have some of the same concerns. So as you start to look at a case study, realize if you happen to be doing one for your dissertation, or if you're a faculty member trying to help a student do this type of research, that there may be many opportunities to continue on research to a greater extent once the dissertation is completed. The same thing can happen in organizations or doing any kind of case study research in any environment, that the case study may just be the first piece of information that's generated from the research, and that opens the door to others. Now, here are the general types of case studies. There are different types of case studies, and each one of them has its own unique reason and purpose for being. And so I'm going to go through each of these in this lesson strategy. I'm going to explain to you what an explanatory case study is, what an exploratory case study is, what a descriptive case study. Now, these three tend to be the more common case studies in doctoral research. I'll address what's the difference between that single multiple case study. I'll give some guidance on what intrinsic, instrumental, and collective case studies are. The intrinsic and instrumental, along with the collective case studies, are very rare in doctoral dissertation research, at least in my 20 years of doing that kind of mentoring and dissertation chair work. They have their purposes. And what I'm trying to do in this lesson of understanding about qualitative research, it's just not to make you understand what is good for a dissertation, but help you to become a better consumer of qualitative research in many different ways. The first type of case study that I'm going to provide for you some background is the explanatory case study. The explanatory case study is where we ask people to explain something to us. Perhaps exactly what happened. Explain to us what they believe they saw. Explaining something is different than describing. I'll go over a descriptive case study as well, but explaining is where you ask people to explain things. Now, you can't really ask people about what life is going to be on Mars because they haven't gone to Mars yet. So how can they tell you what life would be like on Mars? You can't ask them to explain it. You can ask them other questions, but because they've never really done it, that would be more applicable to an exploratory case study because they would be giving maybe their best guess, their best understanding of what they know based on what they've read or what they've researched. But an explanatory case study is where we're looking for these deep explanations. Consider that hospital situation. If you talked with several nurses, you talked with several doctors, you would get rich explanations if you ask them about what happened. What happened when the first ambulance pulled up? 45 minutes later, when another ambulance pulled into the parking lot, what happened then when you went from one patient to two patients in the emergency room? You might want to ask them to explain how they managed their work differently when the third patient showed up and 20 minutes from the time the second one showed up. These deep, rich explanations help us to understand what people were thinking at the time when they were doing their work. This brings a sense of order to the unknown. All we may know the next day when we came to work, if we were one of the senior leaders of the hospital, is that they had 5 people who showed up in ambulances within an hour and a half time frame, and it was kind of hectic. Well, now when we do this explanatory case study, we can ask all these people to help us understand what happened, and now we can see, oh, well, when the second ambulance pulled up and dropped off the patient, they didn't move the ambulance right away. So therefore, when the third ambulance pulled up, they couldn't drop off the patient where they were supposed to. And now we can start to gain a sense of why some patients were delayed in getting into the emergency room, why healthcare was delayed. Not necessarily because of what happened inside the hospital, but because of the movement or a lack of movement with the ambulances to get the patients out of the ambulance. Perhaps maybe by the time the 4th or 5th ambulance pulled up, there were very few people from the hospital to help the ambulance drivers, the first on-site responders, to get them out of the ambulance. So the paramedics may have had to do more work in the ambulance because there was nobody to help them get them out. We still want to ground it in some sort of framework, particularly in a doctoral dissertation. When we're looking at healthcare, we want to find out, for example, what happened. Well, we might want to look at, particularly in the nurses, how their framework of nursing is. Perhaps from Nightingale, the nursing framework, a conceptual framework that has provided foundational work on how nurses operate and how they manage their work. Now, we might also have other frameworks from a leadership perspective when we're talking to the staff members. So it would be common to find out that if we're doing a multiple case study, we're talking with different groups of people, we're going to have to ground our work in different frameworks, because a nurse may not necessarily be making decisions based on the same frameworks, the same understandings, and the same training that a doctor has had, or the senior leader of the organization, or of an ambulance driver. And so this is where we start to see this really robust opportunity come out of a case study, because we have many different ways to look at a case study. Now, the exploratory case study is an opportunity, again, if we want to get information from somebody about finding out what life would be like on Mars. Nobody's been there, so we really can't ask them to explain much about what life would be like, but we can ask them, how do you understand it? How do you believe that life would be on Mars? We are here now trying to make sense of the unknown again, and that's really what case studies help us do, is get information perhaps about a car accident. Here's another example. There's a car accident, and maybe the 4 or 5 people that are walking down the street recall it different, because we know that not everybody recalls everything exactly as they see it. Think of the police detective who comes and makes the determination of how the accident really happened. The detective talks with a couple different people to kind of reconstruct what happened. This is often what we do in exploratory research when people don't always understand exactly what happened. Doing research in an area not done before, this is common for an exploratory case study, because you're exploring something. Think of people who are explorers and they go out and then they come back and we try to find out information from them. Nobody's done that before. It's like going to Mars again. Nobody's been there. So we're trying to do some research in an area that nobody's done before, so we can construct some meaning out of that, make some sense out of the unknown. The exploratory case study, like all qualitative research really is, it's subjective to the researcher. Again, I may do my exploratory case study a little different than you might. Doesn't necessarily mean that either of us are completely right or either of us are wrong. But we all have our biases, and we all have what we hope to understand. And in some cases, even though qualitative research doesn't come with hypotheses to test, we still have that hypothesis educated guess about what we anticipate the data to produce for us in regards to finding. Produce findings not previously provided. This is what we want to do with all research, really, but particularly in this exploratory case study, because nobody's really done some of this before, because it's a unique situation, is that we're going to produce findings not previously provided. And sometimes when we produce information that's not previously known, some people don't like it because they don't understand it, because it's something different. So it's not uncommon that when people read the results of a case study that they think, oh, that can't be the case. But that's only because they're blinded by their biases or they've never seen it happen before. I always ask students, what's one thing you found that you didn't expect? I do this even in corporate research. I always try to find something I didn't expect, because usually that can be the one piece of information that's needed the most. Because if I didn't expect to find it and you didn't expect to hear it, well, perhaps maybe that's the whole benefit of doing the research. Now, a descriptive case study is a little bit different yet. Again, there's different types of case studies for different reasons. And believe it or not, you have to word the research questions differently for each of these case studies. Now, descriptive case studies, asking people to describe what happened. Think of it as in a process that has a beginning and an end. And you want people to describe exactly what happened. Maybe there was a situation where there was a safety violation and somebody got hurt and people were watching it. You want them to describe exactly what happened. When they describe exactly what happened, you can reconstruct exactly what happened. And you can do maybe an after-action report. You can maybe look at that to find out what really occurred and if something needs to change because of what happened. This is that investigative type approach, perhaps much more different than the exploratory case study, because now we're not looking at anything but something very tight, if you will, something that has a smaller scope, and we're looking to really investigate what happened. And again, this is literally about what happened. Now, explaining is a little bit different, because I can explain what I saw, but I'm not describing what I saw. Sometimes this explaining is more open for subjectivity, although describing something can still be subjective, but it tends to be far more accurate. It's subjective to the interviewees and the researcher. Again, everything is. And we just have to keep this in mind. And this is why. This is important. This is why we look at creating our interview questions that are very specific to what we want to know. In a descriptive case study, we want to be very exact with what we want to know about something. In an exploratory case study, it has more vagueness to it. You don't have to be so specific in the questions. Yes, you want questions that are still going to get you the data you need about the situation. But here, in a descriptive case study, we want the interview questions, all of them, to align with asking people, how do you describe X, Y, or Z? Or how did you describe what happened when you got to work? How do you describe what happened when there was a shooter in the school? This is what we want to know, step-by-step processes, if you will. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about the single case study and the multiple case study, because this is concerning for many students. And it's really concerning for many faculty as well, particularly those who may not really truly understand what a dissertation is. Now, a dissertation is supposed to be something that's significant and substantial. It should be something that's produced that other people can use information from to maybe lessen their problem that they're dealing with, or to gain them some knowledge they never had before. A single case study is one that's only one stakeholder of a situation. That doesn't necessarily mean one person, though it can be. A case study, particularly a single case study, could be from one person. That's not really rigorous to me, but depending on the situation, what you want to research. And you can have just one group, like perhaps in the scenario of the hospital again, where you only interview nurses, or you only interview doctors, or you only interview the senior leaders. That would be single case study, because you're only talking with one group of people that were involved in the situation. And it tends to be, of course, only in one location. You wouldn't necessarily be doing some sort of longitudinal study because that doesn't make sense for a single case study. Single case studies, you do it, you're done. You wouldn't do a single case study and look at one hospital, then look at another hospital and look at yet another hospital and try to find out what's common or problematic amongst all three of them. There's no comparison work because there's nothing to compare it to. You have a single case study. You may interview everybody who works in a natal intensive care unit in a hospital, and with the same kind of questions. You may interview 30 people. They may be from different types, like, for example, different levels of nurses. You might have staff nurse, you might have bedside nurse, you might have a trauma nurse in there, you might have the director of nursing. But if you only want to know some general information, that's still really no comparison work because you're not really looking at them by their jobs. You just want to know what's going on in there, for example. So there's no real comparison work in a single case study. This is why a single case study is not really considered dissertation worthy. I have never seen a student, well, I can't say I've never seen a dissertation that's a single case study, but oftentimes people even call it a single case study, but it's not. I had a little bit of an argument or difference of opinion with a student and a different faculty member at one time because a student called it a single case study, but they were actually talking with different groups. I'm like, well, why is this a single case study and not a multiple case study? Well, they were just using terminology wrong. And in the long run, after I showed them some examples and some definitions, they said, oh, I guess this is not a single case study. And it really wasn't. But the idea is that a single case study, because if you're only talking with one person or one group of people, I mean, how valuable is that going to produce information to really be used beyond the scope of those people involved? I mean, there's nothing wrong with doing research if you only have 10 people in a company. That could be good research, but it's not really going to be significant or substantial for a dissertation. A dissertation is supposed to give a student an opportunity to do many different things with research, to get much information from others, to produce some common findings that others can use. Now, the multiple case study is, needless to say, something that you have different stakeholders of the situation. This goes back to the situation in the hospital. Yes, you would interview 5 nurses, perhaps. You'd interview 5 doctors, 5 anesthesiologists, 5 emergency medical technicians, or maybe there'd be 5 paramedics. Maybe you would interview maybe only 2 or 3 senior leaders who weren't there because you wanted to see what their policies were and if they were followed, for example, during that emergency. But you would be looking at different stakeholders of a situation. Different locations within the same situation, perhaps. You could have what's going on in all the emergency rooms in Denver, Colorado. You could do 4 hospitals that are in Denver, Colorado, and you could be looking at the same exact information at 4 different hospitals. For example, how their ER employees function in a certain situation. Or you may be in a company, let's just say you're in a company like Boeing. Well, Boeing has facilities in many different states in the United States, and perhaps you wanted to find out something that's common in all of those locations. Well, you could do that because a multiple case study would allow you to interview people in one location in California, maybe another location in California, then one in Arizona, then perhaps on the East Coast as well, and find out information. Again, now you can see how robust this is going to be as compared to a single case study. Comparison work is required to a certain extent. While this is not a compare and contrast kind of work that you do, you are going to find out what's common from these different locations. You may also find some things that are not so common, that are different between different locations. And as you start to look at a case study, a multiple case study, think of it as if you had 4 different stakeholder groups, you would have to do 4 different research studies and then find out what's common amongst them all or what differences there are amongst them all. But you would literally take, in the case of the hospital, if you interviewed 5 nurses, you would have to run all that data and find out the answers to the research question that you had, which comes from the data you gained from the interview questions, and then you do the same thing with each of the other groups that you interviewed. So you would have, in the case of the hospital, if you had 5 different stakeholder groups, technically you've got 6 case studies, because you'd have one for each individual group that you run completely and provide information on what's common within each individual grouping, and then you combine them all together. And that's where you start to get some of this comparison work. You see what's common amongst all of them, and is there something that's only happening in one as compared to others? And that's where, again, you start to see the richness of a case study and how robust the findings can actually be. This is dissertation worthy, as it is in corporate work, as it is pretty much everywhere else. How much you open the scope depends, of course, on the situation. Now, in a doctoral dissertation, because one of the goals is for students to get done. If you're a student, I encourage you not to do more than 5 different individual cases in a multiple case study. If you're a faculty member, I'd encourage you to not allow a student to do more, because at best, a dissertation is something that's going to produce great information, right? But reality is it's an academic assignment. It's helpful for a student to do research with guided instruction so that when they graduate, they have an understanding of how to do research. Even if the student is doing qualitative research, hopefully they'll have enough information that if they want to do quantitative research, they won't be completely starting over again, right? And if somebody does quantitative research, at least they'll have some basic understandings about qualitative research. But a case study, particularly a multiple case study, is dissertation worthy, no doubt about it. Now, an intrinsic case study is completely different than the other types of case studies in that it's exploratory in nature about a unique issue. When I talk about issues, I mean something that may be going on in society. And think about it, it's internal, that you're actually involved with. I like to look at an intrinsic case study as it's something that I would be literally involved with as a researcher. Yes, I would still have bias, but an intrinsic case study is about looking inward, just like the word basically sounds. And oftentimes a researcher is guided by self-interest. And this is why you do not find an intrinsic case study common in doctoral dissertation research, because doctoral dissertation research is not supposed to be about oneself. Now, you could do an intrinsic case study. Let's just say, for example, if you were an American Indian and you wanted to find information about your history, and that might be an opportunity for intrinsic case study because you're doing it about self-interest. And this could be something maybe you want to use to gain information to write a book later, or to write some sort of manuscript or publish articles about something. This is not uncommon that one would do an intrinsic type case study. There's no expectation the results have any implication for other case studies, nor extending any theory or generalizing otherwise. Again, it's about what you might want to do. What you do with that information is up to you. Some people like just to do research for their own purposes of understanding who they are, or something that's common about their nationality, or maybe where they grew up. Maybe you want to do an intrinsic case study about your family tree. Well, you might interview different people from your family. You might look at different types of information that your family has left behind, like artifacts, like perhaps maybe diaries. You know, there's no necessarily one set of information that can be used in this type of intrinsic case study. It's not like a dissertation where it is required more so to have formal documentation. Now, an instrumental case study is, again, a little bit different. It creates a view into an issue, just like the intrinsic does, but think of it as an instrument, that it's an instrument of really something that's more of a supporter role, helps us facilitate an understanding of an issue. We may not know exactly what happened, but an instrumental case study is something that creates a view into an issue. It doesn't always necessarily explain the issue. It's just instrumental. The research is instrumental in helping us understand what the issue may be. Maybe we don't go into the issue, but we don't even know what the issue was. So oftentimes an instrumental case study can help us gather data. And this is why when this research is of secondary interest, it's not really going to be something that's replicable. It's not something that other people are going to really look as significant. It's going to be the idea that the instrumental case study that we do, what we find is going to be really not of importance to be the end result. It's the beginning that we get this information and then we do something else with it, like we understand an issue better than we ever had before. And that could be the only reason we do this type of case study. It's not to solve a problem, it's not to fill a gap in the literature, but it's just to facilitate our understanding of an issue. That's it, just to learn more. And there's nothing wrong with that. We do instrumental case studies in our own way many different times. We may not do the formality of it, but anytime you're trying to gain information to understand what happened or what's an issue, then perhaps that's what you're doing. I know as I started to look more at how to be better at sales and why people buy products and services, particularly in my own vein as being an organizational troubleshooter and a keynote speaker, I wanted to get more information. I was looking at much information that's out there as possible, and the result of doing the research was really just supporting information. I wanted to understand more about sales. I wanted to understand why people buy, more importantly. Sales is one thing, but I figure if I can understand why people buy, and once I read a book by a colleague of mine about why people buy, then I'm like, ooh, opened up some big opportunities for me to understand something different. And while I didn't do a formal instrumental case study or an intrinsic case study, the reality is I did without doing the steps. The results are expected to be generalized or develop in some sort of new theory. Well, this is what we do a lot of times, and this would be the outcome. So if the instrumental case study is just a supportive role to understand an issue, well, maybe then we can go to the next step and use that information to generalize something about why people buy, perhaps for me, or if I wanted to create a new theory. And I've created a couple of theories, and I'll show that in a couple different lessons, how I did that, particularly in the grounded theory lesson. But this might be a great opportunity to take the instrumental case study findings and then go out and do something more, like develop a theory, because now you have the information, right? Because you understand an issue better. Now, a collective case study is really what you may read about, but you'll find that it's really nothing more than the multiple case study, which I already shared. Depending on, sorry, Kathy. Again, depending on who you talk to and the variation in what people know, oftentimes people will say, well, you should do a collective case study. And you may never heard that word before because you heard only single and multiple case studies. But I wanted to bring this out because I have seen this confusion happen, and sometimes we just call the same thing different things. Again, you're synthesizing different case studies to find a common and divergent finding. And that's what we do in a multiple case study, is that we synthesize the different cases. First, we do the information for each individual case. Then we synthesize them by bringing them all together. If you happen to be doing NVivo as a software to help you analyze data, well, you would use that to first understand what's happening in each individual case, and then you would put all the information from all the different cases into NVivo and run that separately, because then you would be synthesizing and getting an evaluation understanding of them all. And here's where we create new meaning from different instrumental case studies. So if you wanted to use different instrumental case studies, for example, if you did them on different issues and you wanted to find out what's common amongst issues, then perhaps that's a type of study you want to do. Again, you can call it collective, you can call it multiple. So these are, again, the types of case studies I went over. I talked a little bit about the explanatory, where you really want people to explain to you. And if you have an explanatory case study that you're going to do, your interview questions should all be asking them to explain something to you. Everyone should be, how do you explain X, Y, or Z? The exploratory is more about gaining an understanding about something we really don't know about. Maybe it's that accident, or maybe it's that person who wants to find out more what life is like on Mars. Those can be more so how and why questions. They don't really necessarily have to have any specific words in them, except you never ask a question that's a yes or no reply, because that's a binary outcome and that doesn't give us any narrative, right? We need that rich narrative from a qualitative study. The descriptive case study is designed to help people literally describe what happened, perhaps maybe in a flow chart and a process that's running. the multiple case studies, I've kind of shared that and the difference of that and of the individual or single case study. I went over the intrinsic and instrumental and collective case studies, helping you to maybe better understand that these are ideal research case study designs to use for different reasons, but rarely will you find them in dissertation research. So the case study. First off, I know this lesson's a little bit longer than some of the others, but it just so happens a case study is a lot of information to talk about and help you better understand that a case study is not as easy as it seems. I have a lot of students who think, oh, I'm going to do a case study. It can't be too hard. Well, it's not hard. It's challenging and it's time consuming. When you want to interview 5 different groups of people, well, as you have to break these multiple cases into single case studies and then combine all the data, believe me, Chapter 4 and Chapter 5 get to be quite long, particularly Chapter 4. So if you think qualitative research is easy, it may not be as easy as you think it is. It should be exhaustive. It should be robust. It's not about just finding out a little information from a few people. It's about finding out as much information you can from the right amount of people to help you reconstruct and create that story from the data. It's subjective and thus much scrutiny. So when you talk with quantitative research, they'll say, oh, there's no scientific value to doing this type of human research. Well, social research isn't always the most scrutinized research in the world anyway. But depending on how you do it, you can look at issues of trustworthiness, which I'll address in a different lesson, to help improve the receptibility of your work when it's done. And I can take a good qualitative case study and I can help a student or do it myself and make it very worthy, where one can scrutinize it and look and say, well, you did what you should have done in the design phase. You had experts review your interview questions. You did a field test. You looked at different aspects of member checking and doing everything needs to be done that could be done for trustworthiness, and you have a great outcome. So it's can be subjective, no doubt. And you know what? Don't let somebody tell you, well, it's not as good as quantitative research. For everything that's good about quantitative research, I can also find things that are not so good. And the outcome of a case study can be this huge value. Think about the hospital setting. The hospital setting I've been describing in this lesson really happened. Years ago, about 10 years ago now, there was a shooting in a theater in Aurora, Colorado. So happens I was involved in some of the research afterward. This was real and it had produced a huge value. And one of the biggest values that came out of that research was not what happened inside the hospital. It was what happened outside the hospital after the second and third ambulance pulled up and all the reporters started showing up. Yes, it was 1 in the morning, but the reporters were there and they started blocking the way for the other ambulances to get in and for family members to get in and for volunteers. You never know what you're going to learn in a case study. And so keep in mind that you can have a huge value. And for you, if you're doing doctoral dissertation research or if you're a dissertation chair or committee member and you have the opportunity, oftentimes it's easy to expand the scope of a research study for a dissertation without a lot of extra work being required. But the ability to open the scope up a little bit, be a little bit more creative in how you do the study and the questions that you ask could produce a huge value. It can be used for post-publications. A dissertation, the findings, could be used for different things. You can publish a dissertation. You can use the information in different ways. You can produce this information from a case study based on one theme and just focus on that and address that. If you produce 6 or 7 themes, you might have 6 or 7 articles. Think about how robust. The more robust, the larger the value, the more opportunities you have to help people to gain insights from your work. Helps researchers to become an expert. Imagine doing research in that hospital. You would become an expert on emergency room operations. Chances are you'd have to be to do the research anyway, but whatever you're going to research, whether it be a descriptive case study on a process that's working and how the flow chart is set up and how things are happening, you can become an expert by going through the case study research opportunity and really learning something that you never expected to learn before.